Welcome everybody, I hope you're having a good week. I've had lots of requests for this subject, so here we finally go with the long-awaited basics of watercolour. I'm going to talk about 4 different techniques today and give you examples of when and how to use them. Check below for the timings of different sections if you want to jump or concentrate on one in particular. The wet on wet and wet on dry techniques are about how to use paint in order to get the most effective outcome, depending on what you're painting. It is the most common way that watercolour paints are used. Later on in this film we'll talk about using some more modern up-to-date methods, but the next few minutes are going to be about the ABCs of watercolour painting. Wet on wet is when you soak the paper with water before you start. This way, when you add the paint, it will bleed wherever it wishes to go. It's good for backgrounds or skies or water. Basically, it gives you a starting point with a painting and can take away what I call the white paper fear. This is when your paintbrush is hovering over a pristine piece of paper and your brain tells you that you're about to ruin it and you're reluctant to sully it, like being the first person to step into a snowdrift. Wet on dry is when you paint on a dry surface, or when you paint with water and then add the pigment. When you use water, you can control where the pigment goes without using your brush too much. The joy of watercolour is letting colours mix and allowing them to go where they want to. It's a very organic process. So you can create sharp lines using water and the pigment won't go past that wet line. Always be as minimal as possible with this medium. If you overwork, the colours will be muddy, or you'll get holes in the paper because it can't take what you're doing to it. The official rules of painting with watercolour state that you should start with lighter colours and move towards the darker colours. This is what I'm doing in this painting. I'm starting with the sky and the paler hills and working towards the viewer, putting in details last once my paper is drier. This rule is worth noting because unlike acrylic and oils, watercolour is hard to paint over. The dark pigment will always come back through. Those of you who have worked with ceramics will know that the same applies with glazing. The strongest colours will always fight their way to the surface every single time. However, it is possible to play with this idea once you know what you're doing, by using black paper and applying your whites last as highlights. Remember as well that watercolours dry much lighter than they were when you first put them onto your page. Always add your details last, because they're often sharper this way when your paper is completely dry. When painting the trees on this little landscape, I began with a line of paint, which I then blended on one side to create the sharp edge to work with, but then blended wet on wet to create the mixture of greens of the foliage. At the very end, when I was sure the picture was absolutely dry, I added the tree trunks and some shadows. Remember, with watercolour, less is more. Don't overwork, let nature do its thing for you. I really hope you're enjoying my videos and that they're helping you learn something new. Remember, what I'm doing is giving you ideas. Nothing is written in stone when it comes to art. The whole point of what I'm doing is to show you established rules and techniques which you can then adapt to your own practice, twisting and bending those rules to fit what you want to create. There are methods and practices, but no rules. Remember, I'm teaching you these so-called rules so that you can break them with wild abandon once you know what you're doing. If you can mask a part of your paper, you can protect it from the paint and keep it white. This is how batik works, and you can adapt the technique here. Special masking fluids can be bought to protect your paper, and while they're good and worth the money if you can afford them, they are expensive. I use wax and something called a janting tool, which is a tool to direct the flow of the wax, like a little spoon. You can create some beautiful patterns, but here I wanted to give you a quick demo with something you might have to hand, so I've just used a candle. Make sure the candle is free of dust before you start, so that it doesn't end up dirtying your picture, and make sure the kids and the animals are out of the way. Pour your melting wax onto your paper wherever you want to protect the paper from your paint. When the wax is dry, apply your design. Here I'm creating a night sky. Again, be gentle and don't overwork it. Let serendipity do its job. Enjoy watching paint spread and mix on the page and decide where it wants to go. Watercolour is a medium that doesn't want to be controlled too much, so don't try to. Watching it spread is half the fun, in my opinion. I love watching it creep across the paper, spreading its tendrils into the texture of the surface I'm painting on. As with the trees on the landscape, I put my horizon line in by blending one side of my line with water. Then the plants were created organically by blowing on the paint and letting it travel. This makes the natural forms look more natural. Don't try too hard with this medium, allow for happy accidents. When you're ready, pick off the wax. Don't try to heat it or melt it off, just like you would with fabric if you were creating a batik piece. You will leave greasy marks on your paper. Just pick it off cold. It's oddly satisfying that way anyway, and you will make a right old mess. But we artists are supposed to be messy. That's what I always tell myself anyway. And my partner just rolls his eyes and walks away. I love using salt with watercolour. It takes some patience, but it's well worth the wait. Again, it involves you letting go of trying to control the paint and leaving it overnight to form its own patterns and effects. It's worth playing and experimenting with this one. Start with paper that has a high GSM, that is, something thicker is better. This paper is going to take quite some abuse from you. Wet your paper as much as you dare and add your colours. Let the wet on wet technique I talked about earlier do its thing. Adjust salt crystals. You can use ordinary table salt or buy rock salt for a different effect. I like using the rock salt myself because it gives a more dramatic finish, and I am a drama queen, so that makes sense. You'll see instantly that the salt sucks up the moisture, and if you leave it overnight to completely dry out, you'll see some beautiful patterns in the morning. Brush off the salt crystals and overpaint whatever you were planning for your piece. The technique is good for starry skies, wall or rock textures, or animal skin such as reptiles or amphibians. This final technique is a little bit abstract. It's good for backgrounds, for anything non-representational where you're working with pattern. I've made some book covers and wrapping paper using this effect. As with the salt piece, work wet on wet and soak your good quality thick paper, but use as much pigment as you can without muddying your surface. Lay over some plastic wrap, scrunching it up, moving it around until you're happy with the way the paint is pooling together. You can use different plastics for this. Bubble wrap is good, but don't use anything with ink on it already, like a plastic shopping bag, because you run the risk of the ink coming off the bag and transferring onto your piece. Again, have the patience to leave it alone for a few hours, and then remove the plastic to reveal your pattern. This technique doesn't do anything particularly useful for the realists, but I think it can be pretty, and people will always appreciate a gift wrapped in something you made yourself, or ask you where you bought that notebook from when you've covered it in your own artwork. So I hope I've given you some ideas today. Remember, watercolour is quite a loose medium. Let it flow and do its own thing and you'll have more success. Go and do some experiments so you know what it can do. Have a play with the techniques just for the joy of putting paint on paper. You could get the kids involved and do a giant abstract piece. I often get a lining paper from the DIY store. The paper's usually quite thick and sturdy. Roll it out on the kitchen floor and make a mess of colour with the family. It's fun and expressive and joyful, and the kids will be proud of what they created while you get to express yourself too. So have a go. I look forward to seeing the results. As always, please subscribe to the channel and sign up for the weekly Artymous newsletter below. Join me on Instagram and Facebook for more tips and tricks, and tell me if you're having trouble with something creative and I'll help you out. See you soon.